Hi, good afternoon, Jim from Avstar. We're living in a time where, it's criminal behaviour to overlook, the events relating to magnetic poles on our planet and the reversal that we are going through at the moment. Just because it's not accelerated and, we're not seeing, you're not looking at your compass in your hand as it goes 180 degrees over to the south, doesn't mean that this is not happening, because it clearly is. And what is scientifically wrong is the lack of reporting with regards to it. I'm over here on NASA, and a lot of this stuff is old fashioned. I mean, look, we're going back to 2021, 4 years ago, August the 3rd. And very little is being recorded on it. A rare event like this, even if we're talking excursions, still 12,000 years ago. If we're talking completed reversals, we're talking 780,000 years ago, which incidentally is 500,000 years overdue, because on average, every 300 to 350,000 years, our Earth went through a magnetic pole reversal. What's the impacts on climate? Well, why don't NASA talk about more of that? And why don't NOAA? Because NOAA are instigated in this article as well down here. They've got their little say-so here. Look, space weather impacts. And of course, what's being pursued here is the opinion that when our poles go through a reversal, that the only thing that will change will be the direction of which your compass points. In other words, north will be pointing where south is now, which is absolutely bonkers. How can they say it has no impact on climate change whatsoever? How can they concentrate so much on CO2 and put that forward before the magnetic poles reversing on our planet as a direct result of climate change? How does it, you guys know, I've told you this many a times, how does it impact the climate? Well, it sets up cloud seeding. Yeah, cosmic rays coming through the upper atmosphere. They generate perfect condensation platforms, and when that happens, you get more water precipitation building up in the jet streams. The jet streams become more sluggish, and they fracture. That's why you get like over 1,000, 2,000 miles, in some circumstances, wide jet streams, and stretch pretty much all around the world. But they fragment, and when they fragment from polar regions into subtropical, well, is it any surprise we get these flash floods? Record-breaking precipitation, flash floods, 100-year, 200-year records broken. Floodplains that haven't seen floods in 200 years all of a sudden become lakes within weeks. Streets. Largely, I would say city floods are caused by a different anomaly. That's lack of infrastructure and keeping up with, modern infrastructure with regards to water drain off and sewerage. But why don't NOAA, why don't NASA talk more about the impacts on climate with relationship to the magnetic poles reversing? You're more likely over the target when you're talking about the effects of the magnetosphere being weakened. It's not just the impacts on climate, it will be the impacts on human health as well. Now, United Nations, I guarantee, are going to put the banner in on the bottom of this video, telling everybody that climate change is a result of man burning fossil fuels. Basically, that's what it's going to say. It'll say a little bit more, but they're going to be pointing the finger at CO2 is the cause of climate change. And of course, CO2 is just an excuse for organisations like the United Nations, NOAA. I'm not going to accuse NASA too much of it, because I know that no one would have worked for that company, NASA, if they didn't have respect for its achievements in the past. And you've got to give them credit where credit's due. NASA have done some amazing work and contributed massively to science. So it's just unfair if we just beat them with a stick and say you're not doing this and you're not doing that, because they've done a lot. But what you got to realise is that NASA relies on public taxpayers' money, handouts. And of course, if you have a lot of people lobbying governments, like the United Nations, saying that you must get on the the hymn page with us, and it has to be CO2 that causes climate change and nothing else, then they've got to, at some point, if they want to continue keeping their jobs first of all and keeping their projects online, then they have to, sadly, start singing from the hymn sheets that they've been given. Now, we've seen a lot of politicians around the world be lobbied in similar manners by APEC, foreign governments intervening in politics and things like that, but we'll try and keep it science related. I think it's a crying shame that a lot more work hasn't been done into the research and the effects on climate with regards to the poles reversing on our planet, because we are here right now in the process of those poles reversing, albeit slow at the moment, and we should thank our lucky stars, because if we see a rapid movement of the poles, then it will mean that there is a also rapid decaying of the magnetosphere, and that, as you guys know, causes cardiac arrhythmias and also cancer. And of course we don't want that to happen, but that's just the biological effects, not just to human beings but to all life across all ranges. But then there is the effects on climate, which again can have a knock-on effect on us. We rely on seasons delivering expected amount of precipitation, waterfall, and that's what keeps our crops being produced. So when the climate gets affected, we can see at both ends of the spectrum. We can see forest fires caused through drought and dry vegetation than normal. We can also see flooding, and both of those are not good for crop production. Now think about it, we've got 8 billion people on our planet. We require a huge resource of food to feed those people every day. And here in the West, we're very lucky. We're spoiled, actually, because we can get our hands at the supermarket on pretty much food from all over the world. But it's becoming more expensive. And growing seasons are being affected. Now, are they being affected by the poles that are migrating, allowing a weakened magnetosphere to allow more cosmic radiation inbound, causing, super jet streams that fragment from polar regions down to subtropical and subtropical up to polar regions? I ask you the question. It's likely, isn't it? In fact, it's more likely the cause of climate shifting on our planet than it would be to accuse CO2 and, cattle producing methane. They've picked on the wrong things here, and it's damaging to science. It really is, because if you are so blinkered as to the possibilities of the causes of climate change, and you start emitting things like magnetic pole reversal, then you could be making one of the greatest mistakes of human history through doing so. So it's a very serious topic. The other thing that's not talked about so much, and of course, we have experienced the best of the Milankovitch cycle, that interglacial period of 15,000 years. Some say we are already 6,000 years on top of that, going back into a glacial period. Now, we don't know if at some point the Earth goes through a thermocline out in space where the Earth rapidly cools. I'm not talking overnight, sub-zero temperatures. All of a sudden we've got Arctic temperatures at lower latitudes. I'm just saying we could go through a thermocline. Again, why haven't NASA even, put such ideas down on the table as theories? They don't have to say that that is the case. They can just call it a theory. But at least it expands the imagination of people that are interested in this topic and other scientists to possibly, do a little bit more extensive research into those possibilities. It's a disservice to science what we're seeing right now. It really is. And of course YouTube don't help, when they go after a channel like this, that its main topic is, the magnetic pole migration. Has been for over a decade now. But you can see what they're doing to the channel. And that's because sometimes we do talk about controversial subjects that are related to governments, and you can't help but avoid such conversations, even if they are, controversial topics, because, the corruption within government is responsible for probably the biggest mistake ever made in climate science, by pinning it down to methane being produced from animals. We've had animals on this planet for thousands and thousands of years. We had, if we go back to the prehistoric levels and time, the majority of our atmosphere was CO2. It was only through the increase in zooplankton in our oceans that scrubbed most of the CO2 out of our atmosphere and allowed us to have, in return, a nice reservoir of oxygen and not so much CO2. It took millions of years to do it, but the Earth was still here. They talk about the levels of CO2. I mean, the last time I'd done it was less than a week ago, wasn't it? We was at 430 parts per million. In commercial growing greenhouses around the world, they purposely inject into the atmosphere of the greenhouse CO2. They take it straight up to about 1200, 1400 parts per million, because CO2 is plant food. It will require CO2, it will require other subminerals in the substrate or in the soil, and it will require water and of course warmth. Those are perfect growing conditions, and that's why they inject CO2 into the greenhouse, because it helps thrive whatever it is, the intended crop. So my point is this: if you go on a train tomorrow and you're sat in a crowded carriage, then don't be surprised if you was to have a look at a CO2 monitor or detector. It would be probably around 2,500 parts per million. And the thing I want to mention here is you're not passing out, you're not feeling a little bit queasy, you're not feeling sick. There's plenty of oxygen in there, even at those levels. And some people commute for hours every day without any harm whatsoever. So crying like babies, over 430 parts per million is ridiculous. It absolutely is ridiculous. In my living room right now, probably at about 700 parts per million. There's only me in here. But if there was another person, it'd probably be close to about 800 or 900 parts per million. And the point is this: if I'm in an environment where the CO2 levels are at 800, 900 parts per million, and I go out my front door into an environment that's 430 parts per million, well, that surely is better than being in the living room, isn't it? There's more cleaner air outside my front door than there is inside. But they've criminalised CO2. They've made it out to be the bad guy, and they've done the same with cattle that produce methane. It's terrible. science that's been done, and you know, they're going to be laughing at us, simply as that. You know, they are going to be laughing at us in the future when they look back and they say, how could they have got it so wrong? And then maybe they might look into it and say, hold on, hold your horses. This wasn't a mistake they made. This was purposely done. This was done for all of the backhanding funding that was getting distributed out to all these green energies, green companies, you know, EV companies like Elon Musk, you know, £250 billion handout from the taxpayers in America to produce EVs, electric vehicles. £250 billion worth of subsidies given to a multi-millionaire or multi-billionaire, one of the richest men in the world, and he's getting handouts off the taxpayer. What did we ever get here at the Mavstar Observatory that dedicated ourselves and research to the magnetic poles? I'll tell you, right as it stands now, we have 120 people that are subscribed to us on Patreon, and that's how we raise our funding. And yet we track the magnetic pole every 3 seconds and relay that information every single month, and have done for the last 6 years now without fail. It's an absolute crime against science. It really is. Anyway, guys, I hope you learned something today in this little discussion about the magnetic poles and how that has an impact on climate. And maybe if you want to, there's a link down there. You can join us on Patreon or make a one-off donation, entirely up to you. Hopefully we can continue bringing the magnetic pole position to yourselves in a form of fashion without too much hindrance from YouTube and, you know, organisations like the United Nations, who I'm sure will put a banner on this video. As always, bye for now.